doing that representation thing, which is going to be a talk on just representation in general in games. So normally when there are representation talks, they're specifically about why you should try and represent marginalized people, or there are panel already consulting on like a specific identity, like a specific racial identity or gender identity or what have you. And there aren't so many resources out there for getting help when you're just deciding, you know, hey, I want to have a character with a marginalized identity in my game, where do I start? So this is intended as that starting place. So who am I? I'm at Kitsubasa on Twitter, tweet me. I am a narrative designer. I mostly do solo development stuff at the moment, and I also have a Master of Arts in Media Studies, so those are my credentials. As far as specific stuff, my master's thesis was on cultural engagement in video games, so looking at how games try and represent different cultures and the ways that they create systems to interact with them. My last project was a visual novel called Inverness Nights, which is about a gay man in 18th century Scotland breaking up with his boyfriend. I am queer, but I am not a gay man, so I had to try and get an idea of how to research that group for it. So that's my knowledge base for this presentation, basically. And now I'm doing something much less stressful, which is making an interactive fiction game called Captain Dracula, which is about as serious as it sounds, so there we go. So I think the best place to start is discussing what representation is. So at like the base foundational level, every character is representative of something, just all of their component traits. So for instance, with Geralt from The Witcher, he's representative of adoptive fatherhood, he's representative of being a skilled labourer, and he's representative of being a card game enthusiast. Now with each aspect of someone's identity, there are some that are kind of high-stakes representations. So like card game enthusiasts aren't exactly a group that face any sort of discrimination or marginalization in the real world, so you don't have to worry too much when you're representing someone being excited about card games. But then you've got other stuff which is higher stakes representation, where there are elements of an identity that, you know, can result in legislative or social problems against a person, or all sorts of financial, all those sorts of elements. So for instance, in the case of the character of Spectre Knight from the Shovel Knight DLC, he's got some low stakes representative elements, like there are so many dads in games, here's yet another game dad, here's like a stepdad figure. Here's a goth, which isn't particularly high stakes, but he is also queer coded. In like a particularly heavy-handed way, where it's barely coming under plausible deniability. His partner throws a heart-shaped locket at him and says he considers him family, so yeah. And that is a higher stakes form of representation. So why is that? So with any form of representation, if you've got a character trait that's underrepresented, that's a high stakes trait, then that means that it appears less frequently in fiction than it does in real life, or it appears from less angles than it does in real life. What that effectively means is that that kind of representation, anything that you bring up in your game, there are less other media objects to compare and contrast relative to that trait, and so someone with that identity in real life can end up with a lot of harmful stuff stacked against them, or they can end up with nothing to turn to in media at all, and those are the kind of problems that arise. So, for instance, at the beginning of this year when Spectre Knight came out, if we assume, as the coding would imply, that he is like a queer parental figure, there weren't really any of those characters in games, and so there wasn't anything to contrast him against. If you sat down and you were like, I am a gay dad, who am I according to video games? That would be it. But when you have good representation, you have other examples of that trait to contrast. They cover a wide variety of bases, and they go into varying levels of depth. So you have an idea of who the identity is, both in like minor character form and in playable form, and all across the board. So when Dream Daddy came out, suddenly you have a whole bunch of that particular archetype to contrast against it. And if you are, you know, a queer father in real life, suddenly you have a whole bunch of different people saying that you are not just a goth in a fantasy land, you can also be a regular guy who likes music and runs a coffee shop. So where representation where good representation is considered, there are kind of 3 steps when you're coming at it from an unfamiliar angle to trying to get it right. So I would consider those 3 steps to be researching the angles that a trait is frequently shown from, so that you have an idea of, what limited representation exists for an identity and what gaps there are. Consulting people who have that trait to make sure that what you're doing is broadening or deepening the portrayal in a valuable way. And then lastly, utilising feedback that you receive on your final game or on demos or what have you to improve the portrayal that you have there and to make sure that any future portrayals of that group are better informed. Or alternatively, if you can't be bothered doing all that, or if you have money, you can just hire people from whatever group you're portraying. Good is getting sensitivity readers at the end of the project to take a look, make sure you haven't done anything hugely wrong. Better would be if you can get playtesters while you're producing a game just to give you feedback the whole way through. And then the best is if you have team members who are of that identity, because then you will have someone who is on board, understands your team dynamic, understands what you're doing, and can give you the best information for whatever you're up to. But obviously in some situations you can't get these, like if you're doing a one-man project and you can't really hire anyone on, or if you're not in charge of hiring. In those sorts of scenarios, then you just kind of have to continue on your own, and that's what this talk is for. So firstly, with the research phase, you should be specific when you're trying to decide who you're going to be representing. So when you sit down and you're thinking, hey, what kind of characters are going to be in my game? If you've sat down and just said, I'm going to have an Asian person as the lead, you're not going to be able to do very good and specific research on who that person should be, what sort of issues come up with that, unless you're quite specific about who you're looking at. So in that situation, you might say, what is the history of Chinese New Zealanders? Because a lot of the time it'll turn out that there are certain traits in a group that overlap with other similar groups, but a lot of the time there'll be specific identity aspects that you're not getting if you're just looking at those broad categories. So once you've got your specific trait that you're going to be looking at, the next thing to do is find out how the trait is portrayed. So the best way of doing that is kind of doing a 3-step process where you first of all find nonfiction on the trait, then you find fiction on the trait, so you've got an idea of where the group have come from, what people currently do with them in the media, and then finally looking at blogs, editorials, podcasts, any sort of opinion thing that you can find on the internet or at talks at conferences or what have you, where people from the group bring up their personal grievances with the sort of portrayals that arise. A lot of the time, some of the stuff that you'll notice recurring, you'll pick up intuitively, but then there are other times where, only someone who's familiar with the group will realise why a particular recurring element is a problem. So another thing that you'll notice when you start doing research is that people want different things and people hate different things. Not everyone wants the same representation. If you asked, a few straight white guys who they want to see in games, some of them would say Mario, some of them would say like Solid Snake or what have you. Underrepresented groups, however, usually have broad gaps in representation, which you'll be able to pick up on through the research process. Finding those broad gaps will give you ideas of like big no's that you should be avoiding or big requests that the group is after overall. So a good example of that would be, for instance, if you look anywhere at like media targeted at lesbians, it'll say stop killing lesbian characters. It's pretty easy to tell when you look at that a big thing that you should not be doing is killing lesbian characters. What you do with your lesbian characters aside from that, that's probably something you'll have to fine-tune, but you know the big no at that point and you can go from there and at least not step in that particular huge pothole. So once you've done that foundational work, you can begin making a character who's going to offer some decent representation of that trait. Knowing the baseline of what not to do will normally put you way ahead of even a huge number of well-meaning people out there. So a good example of this is, I won't name it, a lot of people will recognize it just from the description. There was a podcast recently that had 2 lesbian characters introduced by a very, very well-meaning guy early on. Both of them die off within a few episodes. Immediately after he did that, he introduced more lesbian characters, kept them alive, all that sort of thing. But if he had, just done a quick search, he would have saved himself the embarrassment and some people the heartache of seeing another lesbian couple die. So to just show some of my research and practice with Inverness Nights and my gay protagonist, I went through some historical records of what the sort of treatment of gay men in that time period that I was writing about was. I watched and read and played relevant work with those sorts of themes and gay male protagonists. And then I found critique on how gay men are portrayed in games in particular to get an idea of what sort of tropes I should be avoiding. So people like Levantine and Robert Yang's work. So what I discovered is that MLM characters, so gay or bi men, are still predominantly coded as femme, so they have feminine traits and they don't tend to be aligned with typical masculine traits. They're hypersexualized or neutered, so if they're hypersexualized, it's usually because they're meant to be like sex appeal for other gay men, or because they're intended as like a scare thing for straight people. Or they're neutered just to try and seem more approachable to straight guys. The sort of, hi, I'm Barry, I fix cars, I am completely non-threatening, I have no sexual attachment to anyone, also I'm gay, that sort of thing. Also, they kept dying. This is like a problem with all queer characters. They die all the time. I love Spectre Knight, but I wanted to bring it up again there. If we ignore the fact that Spectre Knight is potentially gay, the only MLM characters in that game are femme-coded. One of them kisses your player character without any consent, and the main couple of potentially gay characters are both dead or dying, so it trips into all of those holes. I love it, but yeah, it's a problem. So with my work in Inverness Nights, the three things that I knew I had to hit were my character should be masculine coded, he should make his sexuality known at appropriate moments, so like when people are flirting with him and that sort of thing, he should reciprocate, and he should not die. So with the next phase, which is consultation, you should choose your moment, know when to approach sensitivity readers, testers, all that sort of thing. If you can hire those, if you can hire those, then following the standards listed before, like sensitivity readers up front, testers throughout, team members at the beginning, that's good. Otherwise, consultants should be approached when you have specific assets to show them, or if you have specific questions to ask them. So that would be stuff like when you've completed a character or a level design, when you've planned a contentious scene, if you've finished a design document, that sort of thing. That way you have something concrete for them to give feedback on, and you're not just going to be asking wishy-washy questions that waste their time and your time. With finding consultants, using existing contacts is cool, just don't assume that they'll agree to help you. Using forums, subreddits, other public groups for the intersection of that trait and the identity is cool, because normally as long as you approach them with sensible questions that show you've done your research, they will be more than happy to help. Open calls on social media are cool. Do not ask random individuals you don't know to consult on identity stuff, because that is just really weird. Like if someone messaged you out of the blue and said, "You're a man, can I get your opinion on man things?" You'd probably not be particularly thrilled about that, so don't do it with other groups. With consultants, approach them with specific questions that show you've done research. Allow them to set boundaries. If you're approaching, for instance, someone on mental health, asking them about self-harm when you've just said that you're going to ask about depression is several steps too far. And listen to any concerns or suggestions they immediately bring up with the project with empathy and respect, and make sure that you show that you're listening to them. The outcome of getting consultants is that they can iron out the details of your portrayal that you missed when you were just doing your own research. So with the whole "you're looking for big gaps" thing, it's kind of like you're looking for the problems and then your project is the solutions that you've come up with. And they're like a teacher who's going to go over your solutions and say, "That's wrong, that's halfway there, you get a B-, go back and take these things away." So with my work, I went through 2 consultation phases. I would ask design questions of my MLM friends, and I would get playtesting from them on the demo build and also the final release. There were no major issues that they came back with, but one of them asked me if I could show Triss's legs because he was wearing tights, because he considered that to be a fan service thing that would be appealing to gay men. And then another one brought up that I wasn't acknowledging 18th century gay community, which was a thing that existed, and gay characters with disconnect with their community is a thing, so making sure that mine were actually interacting with and identifying with that group properly was important. So lastly, you'll get to your feedback stage. So you will mess up, you will have negative feedback. Not everyone in your trait group will appreciate your character. Your consultant's pet peeves will vary to others in their group, all that sort of thing. There is no way to please everyone, and if you think that you will, it's inevitable that when you're representing a group that consists of millions of people and there have only been 5 of them in games so far, that you're going to stuff up, and that's something you have to, expect. You should try anyway, though. Someone will love you for trying. So this is from a game called The House in Fata Morgana. I played it recently. It's a gothic romance game, and the protagonist of it has a whole lot of messy stuff going on. He is a transgender man called Michelle. Now, as far as Michelle goes, there aren't really many genderqueer or trans characters in romance narratives, especially ones that identify that way rather than just being sort of a dream daddy sort of thing where you can choose to wear a binder and that's the entirety of the identity. So even though there were a lot of missteps, like Michelle has a big abuse arc that probably shouldn't have been included in there, I loved this game as a non-binary person playing it. So yeah. So with feedback, take a breath, process it, remember the fact that it's inevitable, and then confirm whether it's an issue that's just with one person or if a whole lot of people from that group have it. Then once you've got an idea of how big the issue is, research the issue a bit more and see what you can do about it. Then basically apologize publicly, whether you have a fix or not, and outline what you're going to do next. So make sure that whatever action you promise to people after your apology is something that you can action and that you do action, so that you don't look like you're just trying to save face, basically. So with fixing and minimizing your problems, remember that when the trait group makes suggestions of what you've gotten wrong, a lot of the time they'll be suggesting things you can't actually implement because they don't know the process of making games. Try and find a compromise within there, because a lot of the time if it's something like cut this character, it'll turn out that there are a few lines of dialogue or a piece of their design that's wrong. And if you fix that, it won't erase the problem, but it'll at least bring it back to a stage where it's not openly offensive, just mildly irritating to some people. So in my case, I haven't had anything like that I've had to implement yet, but I've prepared a document of likely complaints that people will have when I bring my game from itch.io to Steam. And if any of those come up, I've already prepared explanations on why they're things that have occurred and why fixes weren't possible for them when I knew about them late in development. So in conclusion, try and go through that research, consultation and feedback process whenever you're working with marginalised characters. If you do that, you will be able to minimise your mistakes and make something that people appreciate for the most part. But people will always hate what you do. That's creation, but both on identity stuff and just in general, people will always hate your work somewhere. And just remember that as long as you have respect, empathy, and sincerity when you're approaching people with regards to identity issues and marginalisation and representation, they will normally at least acknowledge your genuine attempt. And even if you do make a mistake, they'll be more open to whatever sort of fixes you're trying to implement. So go on, try and create some cool marginalised characters, and doubtless someone in here will create something to someone else as the team that made House in Fata Morgana. Michelle, my feelings, Michelle is cool. That's, yeah.